Good. So we've started. So we first, I put already the chairs out because I didn't want to do that in the middle. But it's the idea is that first we start with some exploration. So that means we can maybe discuss a little bit more about what Fran has been talking about this morning, and then if there's a natural point coming, we can move to a more panel discussion, and we can put some questions. And if there's no natural point coming, we can also start with that this afternoon. But but we have the option now. Okay.
Okay, we're all ready? All right. um, so I guess, well, I have two questions which are extremely, well, I see a relation between them. One of them is my own, and one of them is from Andrea, she's a student here she's currently in Canada. So my question was related to, as you mentioned, Krishnamurti didn't like to use the word nonviolence, and I think you gave one explanation of it, which was that we tend to expect, if I understood correctly, we tend to expect that we're going to create a whole system that's going to create peace from the top down. But in my own understanding of it, there's another facet of that, which is creating the ideal of peace as something that we look outwardly towards, and therefore we separate ourselves from, or we don't look at the violence within ourselves. So I guess I was just wondering if anybody wanted to comment on that. And I think it's related to the question that Andrea has raised, which is she wanted to ask, or she just texted me the question, what is the role of intelligence in all this? And I think that, I'm assuming she was referring to it in the way that Krishnamurti was referring to it, which is sensitivity, or in all aspects. And so it seems to me that that kind of sensitivity is required in order to understand the violence that we tend to perpetuate within ourselves. So yeah, I guess that's it. If anybody wants to comment. Yeah.
Okay, I'm on. Okay. With respect to intelligence, yeah, absolutely right. And we try to probably in the first couple of slides to bring that up, that the role of it is really to understand the impact that we have on one another and become sensitive about these things as you look at the interconnection of things and how one thing impacts another thing and another thing and another thing, and therefore, then, you have lost the, a framework that peace in it is possible, or the context in which peace is possible. So absolutely right. You want that sensitivity to be there, and that intelligence to look to see how our actions are so interconnected and interrelated, and if things that are standing in a way, you will be able to observe ourselves and become sensitive about them. I tried to kind of cover that like right in the beginning, that about that. And Krishnamurti was absolutely right about the having, not liking the word nonviolence, because it doesn't take care of the very first thing, which is about separations. Like, just like, would that take care of or are we thinking of the separations? And if that's not, then we're going to go and create societies that, again, it has separations in them. In the 20th century, and as part of the 21st century, that has been a methodology of peace building, to create things, to have policies or tactics and methods and of non-harming to address some of the issues. But fundamentally, Krishnamurti is absolutely right about, like, the way that people are interpreting nonviolence is not the way that is being now in the 21st century. We're writing about it, and it's different. But he's absolutely right that, if we just kind of like, think that, well, be nonviolent and that you're going to be okay, that's really the answer to the questions of, to the problems of our time. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, sure.
So I just wanted to point. Is it on? Is it? I just wanted to point out. You're probably already aware of this, but in case you're not, Krishnamurti's objection to nonviolence as an ideal. His objection was not, peculiar or particular to the concept of nonviolence. Krishnamurti objected to ideals per se, of all kinds. Nonviolence, just an example of, a million ideals that we could have or do have, and he objected to them across the board systematically on grounds that, they create a conflict with what is, and by having the ideal, it creates a division with what you are. Wherever there is division, there must be conflict, and that conflict prevents you from coming into contact with the actuality of what is the case. And, he had this view that by coming into contact with the actuality of what is the case, then a meaningful transformation can occur. Whereas if you remain with the ideal and the division and the conflict that entails, then nothing significant changes. That's my understanding of it.
Can that be? Too loud. It's too loud. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. The room is not that big, you know. Okay, okay. So the thing is that is non-violence as such an ideal that we have to live by, or is it a prevention of a human action where we say that look, for an organized society to exist, it's absolutely necessary to have certain rules of existence. Otherwise, there's no organization. And if you say that, well, that's an ideal, and therefore I'm not going to do it, well, that it kind of interlaps with each other. The other point that I wanted to sort of bring out after what he spoke is that the reason why we even begin to enter into this question of non-violence is because there's something within me which wants to do something which might not be very nice, right? Which might be retaliating back at somebody, doing whatsoever. I mean, there are many ways in which we can approach this. The question that often comes to my mind is that can we not address the fundamental problem of why am I so angry about something, right? Why is it that this particular thing angers me? And there is anger all over the world. Even if you see today, I travel a lot and I go to poor countries and rich countries, and it doesn't matter whether you're in England or you're in Ecuador or you're in deep Saharan Africa. It really doesn't matter. Across the economic spectrum, you see people extremely angry. And if you kind of allow that anger to completely go out, because if, let's say, there is no law, right, that prevents anybody from murder, maim, torture, rape, whatsoever, right, then fine, that will come out. But without addressing the fundamental problem that why is there this anger, right? There's something going wrong, but should my reaction to that be that I should become incredibly angry about it? And because when I'm angry, I will be violent. It's obvious. It's a natural natural thing to happen, that when I'm angry, I will be violent. Whether violence to the self or violence to another human being, it's irrelevant. So what I wanted to also explore is, in that context of non-violence, is that can I question, or can I inquire as to what causes me to be angry or want to do something aggressive and violent at the first place. So I wanted to explore that space also, please.
That perhaps we are hurt, kind of like underneath the anger is hurt. So perhaps we are hurt because our self-worth has been diminished, or has been attacked, or has been ignored. We are several reasons that some they're rooted in it's accurate, and some that it's just my perception of things, that they're not so accurate, that I thought versus what I was expecting. This is not happening, and hence I get hurt. So it would be, I think, watching that whole process of that anger rising probably is the place that I need to go, rather than perhaps creating an ideal that as soon as I see that, let me just control it. But the idea is the thing is that, can I observe that? Can I see what is right? Make rise of anger, which is always underneath it is hurt. Is that accurate or not? And how did that all come about? So there's all that exploration into myself to see, is that accurate? And how did that come about? Can I be doing anything else with it? Then kind of like, ignoring how it came about, and I just go out there and say, well, because I'll be nonviolent because it's a noble thing to do. That.
Just briefly, I can't answer why you or someone else is angry. But if I'm angry, then I have an opportunity to observe that and find out for myself why I'm angry. The point in Krishnamurti's teachings, I think, as I understand it, is that if I have an idea that I should not be angry, that idea is going to prevent me from looking to see why I am angry. And therefore, if you do away with the ideal, then you have a better chance of answering the question that you raised.
I just want to add, is it on? I want to add to that that resonates for me as a very scientific approach, actually, that we observe without interpretation. That is our goal anyway, that it is hard to do so, but that in all things we are trying to observe without laying the interpretation of what it means on it, so that afterwards in a scientific method we then try to figure out what it means and try to figure out how we would know if we were right and then do the tests and such. But the observation of what is, absent what we think it means, is a necessary first step in nearly all kinds of human inquiry.
This discussion with anger brings to mind an experience that I noticed, like at a funeral. There will be people that come from different backgrounds who have had some type of connection to a person who is, coming for the viewing to say their goodbyes. And when you look around the room, there will be people who are having composure. They're being able to deal with what they're dealing with in their own way. And then someone breaks down crying. And so sometimes you notice almost this chain effect of one person expressing emotion, and then someone who had complete composure now breaks down, starts crying as well. In some cases, they may not even be crying about the person who's deaf. It's just that somehow, I don't know if it's permission or, whatever actually happens, but then the person starts releasing, or expressing, or however you want to call it. And next thing you know, more people start crying. And it may be they're like connecting to deeper emotion that they never expressed before, and here was an opportunity. But it's not always related to a specific situation. So kind of looking at anger, how much is other people who are closer to us, either in proximity as far as relationship, or just proximity as being in the same room or same environment or same community, or somehow connected, how much that's also tying into our anger. So almost this unconscious transference that may also be having an interplay into this, sometimes consciously and sometimes unconsciously. And how that may even be showing up in conflict. That there may be someone who is dealing with a situation in their own way, but as the violence starts unfolding, it's permission for them to act out, even though they're not necessarily mentally invested in it. But that is what's going on with the group, and it kind of ties into what you were saying earlier, that group mentality starts kicking in. And people are now mindlessly involved, thinking that they're mindful and they know what they're doing. But when in actuality, there's a reaction going on as well.
About the way we go about it, like the marches and everything, not all of us, but people they take on issues, and you know that people are coming from a place of trauma and a place of anger, and then they want to talk about equality, that way, and then they wonder why it does not move forward, or they want to yell and scream, and they are yelling and screaming from a different place, not from particularly for that cause. And so there's right now a lot of trauma is talking, not really people from their heart talking about these issues. That is the illegal thing. So we have to be really careful about watching ourselves as we become more activists in this era, that our activism is through the trauma that we are experiencing, and we are actually expressing that, or are we actually focusing on the heart and really trying to talk about
The comment is so apt on so many levels. The idea of social contagion of emotions, for which we have, you provide an amazing piece of evidence for grief. And certainly we can all think of examples with regard to anger that reached fever pitch, but probably there is social contagion for all of these emotions all the time at much lower levels. And I think what that suggests with regard to one thing about how we might proceed is to make sure that we also take time to be alone, so that we can find our own cadence, so that we can find our own emotional cadence and know what our own cycle of anger looks like, perhaps, although I think actually it's often, when we're being honest with ourselves, being alone and being angry takes work. We have to work to remain angry when we're alone, usually. Whereas, to take the example that you started with, grief for anyone who's grieved deeply, and most of us, I presume, have, comes in waves, right? And when you're with other people, you do find yourself in sync with them, but then you are less sure about what it is that you would be feeling absent that. And so being alone with your own grief, which I think in at least modern American culture, often that's taken as a sign of a problem. Oh, you want to be alone? No, we have to surround you. Like, no, actually be alone with your grief and watch the cycle not be regular, but cycle and change. And sometimes it'll be 6 months later and you'll hit the most inconsolable, unreachable point that you've even yet hit, and that's also okay. But so making sure that whatever deep or strong emotion you're feeling, you try to not just be in group, but also be alone with it to find your own self.
No, I just wanted to comment and continue the vein. When you had said at the end of your talk, and we're talking about when you feel that you are, you're talking about the narrative of victimization, and if you feel that you've been wounded, or that you have, your self-worth has been attacked or undermined. I guess I just wanted, there's two parts to this, just to open up a discussion, is how do you really differentiate between buying into that narrative of victimization, if it's something that you've experienced, and we can talk, and you were talking about, the cycles of colonialism and imperialism, which I think are underlying definitely in some of what you were commenting on when you were talking about the movements in India. And so I guess I want to hear more, because I'm so new to the teachings, of how Krishnamurti would approach that as well. And then also, this narrative of victimization that is often used by those in power really gives us, or gives them, a way to engage and entrench, and I've been susceptible to that, I'm a sensitive person, to a cause or a common enemy, or both. And what would Krishnamurti say? How are you able to have that clarity of mind and thought and that strength to be able to identify when that's being done, and then also many causes and movements, as you were saying, come from a place of deep woundedness and anger that gives us an outlet because we have not had the capacity or the courage, to face our own as well. And so there's this mob mentality that comes in when you go to, this self-righteousness, when you go to these movements and these marches and you feel we're united, but we're united because every cause has to have a common, there has to be something you're fighting against. And it's so hard in this day and age to come from a deep place of, I don't want to use the word peace because that's an ideal. Come from a place of knowing what you are doing and why you are doing it, and doing it in a way that's healing and not divisive. Or, yes, an authentic way.
I keep moving it, but it keeps coming back. Those are very good questions. I guess some part of it about victimization, I would ask David to reflect on that with respect to Krishnamurti's looking at victimization. There is, with movements, what we are fighting against, but it's also the narrative, what are we fighting for? And that's kind of like missing, that what do we want? Like a lot of movements that they fail, it's because they don't really say what do we want. Like, they say, like, yeah, we're Occupy movement, but what do you want? And it's not very clear. It's like, all the fight against is clear, but what we want is not very clear. So we were talking at the end of it about, like, right now, I mean, like, we can build things that make the old system. We don't have to fight the old system. We can create new things that would make the old obsolete, and then we don't have to even fight it. But the way that we feel like we want to express ourselves, we think that that expression would be through fighting against, and that appears easier or more attractive or more compelling to fight against than find out, okay, what is it that we are fighting for? What is it that we want? And let's create that, because that's more of a creative mode and not a fighting mode, but it would be like a very creative mode, and it would be a very engaging mode. We said that we're promoting, like, persistent, creative, persistent engagement. So with that, we really want to be engaged. We want to be creative. We want to inspire, and we want to kind of come together for something as opposed to against something. But I would say, and I would like to ask David to reflect on victimization, because I think you will have a much better explanation from a Krishnamurti's standpoint. Ours is, that peace studies is very hierarchical, and kind of like explains, oh, this happens and then this happens and then you're a victim, and but I would be also interested to see that from that perspective.
So I'm not entirely sure that I am following this exactly, but insofar as I understand it, it seems to me the question is, if I am having some reaction to some kind of complex mixture of circumstances in which I feel victimized, angry, resentful, hostile, and all kinds of things which are confusing, and I'm not sure what is the source of that, or the meaning of it, or the validity of it. Am I justified in feeling this way? Am I truly a victim, or is it a projection of some kind? And if that is the situation, and if you ask yourself, well, how am I to know the true meaning of this, or the true significance of my feeling? And as I understand Krishnamurti's work, first of all, there is no how. There is no sequence of steps. There is only looking. Only looking, actual observation, will enable you to answer that question at any given moment or in any particular set of circumstances. And there won't be one answer. It will be a different answer 10 minutes from now or 10 days or 10 years from now than what it is now. But, so there is no how, but there's only looking. But there is one thing which is important to bear in mind when you're engaged in that looking, and that is that any ideas that you project onto that thing are going to prevent you from looking. And your idea as to what is probably the source of it, or what is a valued source of it, or a legitimate source of that reaction, or even merely the label of the reaction, merely to call it victimization is already to color it and to project certain meanings and associations. There's implicit value judgments in that. Any of that ideation is going to block you from the actual observation, which is the only thing that will tell you the true significance of whatever is going on inside of you.
I want to add something to the question about victimization, not from a Krishnamurti perspective because I don't know it, but identifying, so crime happens, trauma happens, and so there are victims by definition. But identifying as a victim, when it becomes important to the narrative of what you're doing or what you're pushing against, usually, becomes a problem because there becomes a perverse incentive to remain a victim, to remain living in the status of victimhood. And so those who would wear their victimhood status on their sleeves as part of, say, their activism, are less, would become less empowered, in fact, if they would heal. If they could heal and have, say, scars rather than open wounds, to use a physiological analogy. So all of us are presumably victims of some things, and some of us much more so than others. And this is not to deny any of that, but to move forward in an effort to heal ourselves and to help others heal, while also trying to work to minimize future acts that will victimize others, I think involves not keeping wounds open, not proclaiming I am victim everywhere, as opposed to working with yourself, with others, with your people, with as many people whom you can, to heal past wounds and to move forward.
I just want to share about what I see as violent when we talk about peace. I come from China, so I see violence as two different violent. One is like actually fight, war. Another one is it's like dominate and control. So I just feel like there's when I grow up, there's a little bit fight, around me, but it's not a lot. So I can say it's very peaceful when I grow up. But in my heart, I experience a lot of violence. That's, I say, in my point of view, that's violent. It's I kind of like so I'm direct to different place, and I'm asked to do something, and it's not what I want to do. So I see that as a violent to me. And then I become dad, and I found out that I am like my dad. So I am like to control my kids. So I like to put an image on my kids, and I want my kids to do this thing, to be like this, to be like certain do certain things or be certain ways, and then I realized that I was so much into dominate another people, and when I feel angry, it's because that he doesn't fit my image. That's my personal point of view. So just like what David said, just looking and observe that when I see myself like that, I have the possibility of like, okay, relate with my kids. So my kids is not like my tool to fit me or to satisfy me. It becomes another human being that I can relate with or respect. He can have his own right or his own wishes or his own preference or things you want to do in life. So I look at peace now like when I don't know how you look at China, but what I look at China is there are a lot of violent things going on. So it's a lot of, it's not war, it's not fight, but it's dominate people. So yeah, like the government want us to think one way, so not the other. Like we have no access to a lot of internet informations. That's it's because the government want to control us. So yeah, that's something I think it's from that thing, and to the other one is you mentioned about the victim. And if a kid's growing up in that environment, I think he will, like I am, won't be like a victim of not being my own. So I'm always saying that I'm like this because I was growing up in this environment, because that I was asked to do this, because I did not have the opportunity to do my own things. So I think that's it's the violence always comes from inside, not from outside. What we behave is it's something inside me personally, or I think it's everybody, because when China announced independence, and there are a lot more people killed when we are announced independent, or in 1949, there are a lot more people killed even after the war with like invasion or other countries. So that also come from the to me is the violence that's the chairman or the government want to control people, but when people don't want to follow, that's the violence comes. So it's always come from inside. So that's what I want to share.
I don't have a question, but I wanted to comment on Krishnamurti's perspective on this, as I understand it. He always went into the root cause of things and not just the immediate causation. So there may be frustration, there may be anger coming out of it, and so on. So there is a certain explanation of why there was violence and so on, which is not wrong. But change, deep change, does not come from your decision. You cannot decide to be non-violent. Decision is a very small thing in life. You can't decide not to worry. You can't decide to be happy from tomorrow or smiling all the time. So decision is a very small thing in these matters. And yet, life can change. it comes out of a much deeper understanding of oneself and how one's consciousness functions. And ultimately, it is our consciousness, the way it functions, that manifests in our relationships. And if there is violence within me, it manifests in my relationships. And those relationships constitute society. So in a deep sense, unless I am peaceful, society can't be peaceful. I means the individual. Gandhi also said that. He said, you must be the change you want to see in society. And that those words mean the same thing. So essentially, he's saying that you are taking decisions about things in which decisions don't work. And therefore, this idea of practicing non-violence is a false idea. You can't practice non-violence. In fact, he generalized it into saying that virtue cannot be practiced. Virtue is a state of being, a state of consciousness in which there is no conflict, there is order. And that comes only from a deep understanding of yourself and the way your consciousness functions, and freeing oneself of all kinds of illusions that are there in our mind, which can be perceived if you have a learning mind, like you said, scientifically observing in order to learn, not in order to achieve something, in order to learn, because you can see yourself in the mirror of relationship, which is what the theme of our conference is. That in that your consciousness is revealing itself, and if you become a student of it, you can see and understand the functioning of it. From where does it start? What does it do? Without objecting to it and without wanting to deliberately interfere and change it. So it's like also I find a parallel with science, that you observe a phenomenon, you don't want to interfere with it. You want to just observe it first, and then you want, through that observation, you understand. And he is bringing the same kind of approach, not the same method, because these are not areas where you can measure and have a hypothesis. The method doesn't apply. But the approach, scientific approach of understanding something through watching and learning about it. And that learning, the change is a byproduct of learning. This learning as self-knowledge or learning about oneself, like that. So when he was asked this specific question, which we are discussing right now, as to what should one do when a robber attacks you? This question was put to him in the United Nations, where he was giving a talk about this issue of violence between countries and so on. And he said, first learn to live peacefully, not for 1 day or 10 days, but for 20 years. Then you will know what to do when a robber attacks you. That's his take, not my take.
Okay, I think pieces of this have already been said by a bunch of people, but I wanted to sort of talk through the whole thing. So, say I'm a victim of something and I become angry. I, at that point, have two choices. And the first instinct is always, almost always, to blame somebody else. And the second that I blame somebody else, I remove the power from myself to have any effect on that. Now they have to fix it for me. There's one or two, perhaps sometimes in your life you can discuss that with that person and come to some sort of, healing together, but 9 times out of 10, I'm the only person that can heal that. And the only way that I can do that is by sitting with whatever it is that hurt. And we don't like to be hurt. We don't like to be weak. Anger and blame make us feel stronger when we are wounded. And that is more impetus to move away from that. And if we move away, then we end up propagating that hurt to somebody else. The reason that I am hurt is probably because that person was hurting and they took it out on me. And so the choices are, I either feel strong and propagate that anger and spread it to other people, or I sit with this very uncomfortable but real thing. You know, I accept that I'm vulnerable. I accept weak is a total judgment on it, right? But I have to sit and accept what happened, and yeah, look at the cause of that, because there are cases where I'm a victim and I had absolutely no control over anything, but a lot of times the reason that we're hurt is because of our ego or some ideal that we've created, and that is where we have the power to affect that.
So, yeah, many times, like, things happen, and some, I like to take it on other people and blame it, and yeah, sure, we lose power, and sometimes we get to keep the victimization, and that because again, it doesn't, I don't have to be responsible for anything. I don't have to do the hard work that it has happened. That's at the personal level, but also at the level of the world level, there are things that has happened in the past, and a lot of times people, there's one thing that I don't want to be victimized, but then there is this thing that people, they say, well, move forward, and yet we have to move forward, definitely. But then there are, but not bad, but I just want to also bring this in. Lots of atrocities has happened, and it's happening right now in the world, like the privatization and of the commons, and people being pushed out of their land, or pushed out of cultures being taken away, or things that happened in the past, and a lot of indigenous people, they have lost their rights, or in the process of segregation in South, and all those things that happened to African Americans, and there is a wound here, and everyone says, well, move on, yes, move forward. Also, there is a responsibility of also acknowledgement of what has happened, is necessary for us all of us together to move on. Like, I can personally move on, but can we as a society move on? And that's kind of like, or as a humanity to move on. And that doesn't happen until we become sensitive about all these things, and acknowledging that our history has been the history of abuse of each other, and then as a whole to move on. Like, individually we can move on. I'd like to also see as a community, and as a whole, to also move on together by acknowledging things and stopping that behavior to be able to move on. And that's kind of like, in that I see peace. Without that, like, one group might move on, but there's still something in the background. Like, we are the mirror of relationship, right? If we are not, as a society or as a country, moving forward, or as a whole world moving on, we keep creating these things that takes away people's power, and it takes away their dignity away. And that's something that a lot of people, they have in the 21st century, they have problem with, because the dignity of humankind is at stake, and still we are going with the same old systematic way of victimizing each other, and that kind of like needs to be transformed altogether.
I'd like to suggest the possibility that we switch gears a little bit and raise another question, if I may. If it doesn't appeal, that's fine. I'll just put it out there and let it be. So I'm asking myself, after 2.5 days, where are we at? What have we discovered during the course of these several talks and different points of view? And I certainly don't have any answer. Part of the difficulty is that it seems like we have been coming at the question of relationship from rather different perspectives, and it's not entirely clear what is the relationship of one perspective to another or one talk to another. So it's a little bit hard for me to see how the whole thing all fits together. And I do not have any answers as to how it all fits together, but I have just this minute come up with at least a question which kind of puts it all together and which maybe might precipitate some answers. And so I would put the question like this. My question is, what is the relationship between the psychological realm and the biological realm insofar as it affects or impacts questions of war and peace and violence? This is my tentative, feeble effort to put in one question all the things that we've discussed for the last 2.5 days. Meaning by psychological, the teachings of Krishnamurti and the things we've discussed about ideals and thought and emotion. Meaning by biological, the things we've discussed about evolutionary processes and the manner in which dopamine and chemicals influence our emotional and psychological condition. And meaning by war and peace, all the issues that you raised this morning, violence on a large scale and a small scale. So what is the relationship between the psychological and the biological insofar as it affects questions of war and peace and violence and conflict in human relationship?
Can I add a little bit to this? Is it okay? Do you feel that we have explored enough? Because somehow we had the idea of almost naturally going to a movement of the panel discussion, and I had prepared a panel a few questions, or a question, or actually it's more than a question, which is very much in line with what you're actually saying. And I need to take a little bit of time for that, and we can continue it, and that's actually good because there's about half an hour left in this before we go for lunch, and so we can make a start, and then you can do the break think more. Because in listening these last 2.5 days, I see like there are like three strategies proposed. There seems to be like a unanimous feeling that there's a kind of urgency for the global or the global society or for humanity to act. That's one thing. And then there is, even without that urgency, you could say that we might not all agree that humans are suffering, but for those who agree that even without the urgency, there's how would you move forward and solve human suffering, right? And that's a second question. But even if you take that out, if you would say, well, there's no human suffering, which maybe some might debate, even how would the global society move forward from where we are now, based in seeing what is, so not in a kind of imaginary romantic analysis on how would we move forward? And then in the 3 days, I see there are like 3 scenarios or 3 strategies have been proposed. And I mean, I'm most familiar, of course, with the scenario that Krishnamurti proposed, suggested, that actually through the observation of one's own mind, one that could lead to an understanding and an insight, and that insight might inform us into a new way of responding to the crisis, because the crisis, he says, the crisis is somehow not outwardly, it's not due to circumstances, but the crisis in society. The society doesn't exist, the society is you. If we change, the society will change. And there are strategies like, and you can say, so no, how would that come into being? So on one hand, we would say, when we want to learn mathematics, you expose somebody, a person, to mathematics. In the case of the teachings of Krishnamurti, or in the case of making that change to insight, I can even detach it from Krishnamurti, because I think because Krishnamurti points it at, it's not really Krishnamurti's thing, you know what I mean? I mean, that's also a little bit ridiculous, of course. Like evolutionary is not Hedda's thing, you know? It's somehow, it's pointing at a certain direction. So maybe that's easy to talk about that. What is that movement that will bring about insight? And I would say, well, exposing, creating situations for young people and for any person to really spend time observing meditation or mindfulness, and really have that as an integrated part of one's life. And that's and I would say that that's probably where the key is, and especially in the context of this conference, we can even say it's also observing oneself in relationship. So not only observe yourself when you're sitting in a room quietly with your eyes closed, but also, how do I respond to you? You know, I mean, how do I? What is so? Because somehow the whole of my being is being exposed. So that's strategy one. That somehow the inner change, and I'm treating them for the moment just for the sake of simplicity and for comparison as mutually exclusive. But of course they're not mutually exclusive, right? Maybe all three strategies have to be looked at. So that's strategy one. I was proposed my understanding of the teaching. So I might even take that, have misunderstood that, but that's my understanding. And then strategy two is where Heather went to, is that somehow, and that might be have an historic perspective, that somehow narratives are important, or a myth, and that there's a lack of a new, timely mythology, which might actually help the society to cohese or something, or I mean, and it would actually be nice if you could elaborate how that particular myth, how that actually would result then into a different society. And so that's the second strategy. And so I'm giving you all the time to also to speak more to it, because I've tried to bring it out explicitly, so it becomes more transparent, and we can compare and tackle. And I also, it's not the intent to start arguing what is better, you know. And I don't even think, again, also, it's not about mutual exclusivity or a winner in all these three. And then thirdly, what Fran was talking about is, okay, you see the world as it is. There are inequalities, there are power struggles, there are violence and trauma. And maybe through a conscious engineering, social engineering, you could maybe steps, and that the biggest step will, of course, I guess, be policy or something. And then within society, you make deliberate changes, so minimize equality and create societies that are more peaceful according to certain standards. So those are the three that I saw, and maybe there's another one which we'll be happy to look at. But then I have, so if I, just for the simplicity and just for the sake of the conversation, because it's nice actually if you put it out like that, I guess, for me at least. So what are then, if you look at these, what are the underlying assumptions that are being made in each of them? You know, what is the underlying assumption that's been made in by putting out a narrative that would somehow bring about a change? Or with case assumption, with the observation, what is the underlying assumption that are being put out that somehow that we hope or expect that there's a change? And also with social engineering, and I don't know if that's the right word, but okay, I'll put it for the moment like that. What are the underlying assumptions that are being made that would give us confidence that a strategy like that has a potential to work and is also consistent with that what we've learned? Because I feel somehow some things that we've learned, I think, and that's a question. I think maybe there are, like, okay, what we have seen over during the conference, and of course also longer, that the whole thing about conditioning or evolution, we seem to be part of a trajectory of evolution that grows in a certain way, which is not directed, it's not planned, but somehow it does came up with these human beings sitting in this room with these mindsets, and so somehow, and there are certain laws on that. So how is that also consistent with, if you would say, okay, you could say on simplicity, say natural selection of random variation, but maybe there's some more things that are to it that maybe you have to take into account. So how, so that we don't, those elements. So I would like each of you actually to respond to that. How you, so to break it down first, before we go to the implementation, but just to, what are the underlying assumptions that are being made, and how do we ever see that work? How do we really see that's going to, I mean, if you take the time window that Heather was proposing, well, maybe we only have 20 years left, right, to act. Suppose it has to be done in 20 years, because that's what we have. So if you suppose it's the choice like this, you know, I mean, God comes along and he sits here and say, well, okay, you three decide now which strategy. You have to choose for one strategy. You have to choose for one strategy, and that's how we're gonna act that, and that's how we're gonna save the planet. And now, so I somehow with that seriousness, because No, that's why I said it's not mutually exclusive, but for the sake of clarity, to distinguish them, because then actually you can get clarity on the differences on it. Yeah. So, but the urgency, I think, is important. Like somehow that we talk from the urgency. Well, if you have only 20 years, where will you put really your heart and soul in? If you're responsible for this. So I will leave it with the panel here.
Fran and I decided we would fight for it. Okay, to address the question that you wanted us all to answer, which is what are the assumptions in the solution that you proposed, that we had each proposed. I'm gonna waffle a little bit first and say this is, I would say what I was talking about with regard to the importance of narratives that become myth and therefore are able to transform society is one piece of the puzzle. And therefore I would agree that while we will have to choose between some kinds of solutions, and some solutions are better than others, it's likely to be a multi-pronged approach, just as Fran was talking about in her talk today. But with regard to, so for instance, your characterization of Kay's approach being based in observation. I'm not going to try to do all of these, but I would say as soon as you said that, I thought, well, yes, of course. This is part of what we should all be doing. Why I think that will be insufficient is based on the assumption that I have, that I'm starting with, which is what I understand about our long history as mammals, as primates, as monkeys, as apes, as humans, is that we are social, that we are social beasts who specifically as humans have specialized as individuals and then cohere into groups that have emergent truth and power in them. And so while individuals need to do their individual work, we will transform through the emergence that is groups. So I think that walks me into the assumptions implicit in the idea that narrative can become myth, can transform how we think. The assumption is, at our deepest level, one of the things I think that actually makes humans unique, and of course there have been many, many propositions. Is it tool making? Is it war? Is it language? Is it bipedality? Is it the giant forebrains? I think one of the things that really, truly makes us unique is our storytelling. And I can point to neurological reasons, as I did yesterday. I think that this really enlarged forebrain is primarily involved in you're at this moment in time what already happened to you and what do you think of it? What do you think is going to happen, and what will you make of that in light of what you already know? So the scenario building, the future imagining and future building that we do is located in the part of the brain that is biggest in us, that is even more large in us than in our closest relatives. So that's an assumption, and I just explained part of why I'm making that assumption. And then another reason that I'm making the assumption that storytelling is fundamental to humanness is that it is one of relatively few things that shows up across all cultures where it's been looked at. Music is another. Right? There are not that many cultural or behavioral things that humans do that we prize that actually seem to be universal. Within larger activities, there are various universals, but storytelling and music are two of them. So finding ways to create meaning, create emergent meaning through things that we understand to be human universals, therefore strikes me as potentially very powerful. I'll stop there.
Yes, the power of storytelling and doing the narrative is big right now. I think some of my friends that they work on these things and they create narratives of generosity, for example, and then they kind of they keep telling that story until everybody kind of connects to that. Well, there is something inside all of us called generosity, and let's bring that out. And I would say that while as humans we rotate individually, but we evolve collectively. So I can rotate individually and get better and that's that, but we're gonna evolve collectively, and until the myth, like the one on the hero's journey, that's one of my favorites. The hero doesn't become that doesn't finish the story until he or she comes back and tell that story to everybody else, and then his or her transformation is really at the time that he comes back and tell the story to everybody else and causes transformation in everybody else, and that his transformation is then while he has gone through all the journey. So the narrative would be a narrative of coming back and trying to and put a narrative that it's inclusive and it includes all of us in it, as opposed to be just good for some and not necessarily wouldn't include everybody else. And certainly art is something that would bring us together, and would tell that narrative very well. I think also we need to also keep close proximity to problems of the world. We could be observing a lot. Also, on top of that, we should keep really close proximity to the problems to understand what they are like, and so to become sensitive about them, to feel them, that we need to sort of keep close proximity to these problems. Staying away from them, not necessarily it would evoke all the sensitivity that you want to have about these issues.
Just to because the question is somehow, I mean, you're representing for the moment,
Sure,
just
sure.
for the play, how policy or how a nonviolent action could
Right.
contribute to a different society, and how social
engineering.
engineering. So what are the underlying? What evidence do you have that can work? So and based upon what would you? So just
Yeah.
if you can somehow, if you could go into that if possible.
I have no evidence to say that would work. I have absolutely no evidence. I mean, we've got for the social engineering. Yeah, I mean, like no, like social engineering, like what evidence particular kind of like maybe I misunderstood what you were looking for, like but as we come together and create these policies from, they could be top down, but also movements from bottom up, and again, keep them inclusive with everybody. I have seen kind of movements around the world that they have been successful in doing that. And we are doing it now, but we are not telling the narrative big enough for everybody to feel like, they see themselves in it. It's not the overwhelming message right now is that, it's not working. It's us versus them. It's like, that's the one out there. However, it's working now. We are doing this system thinking that I think that it's happening now, but it hasn't been at the forefront that everybody would see that's. But I mean, like if you're looking for like an institution such as United Nations, I'd say no, they are powerless. In doing that. I'm still looking from bottom up. But then again, for those movements from bottom up to create policies from top down, that would help bringing that change. I don't know if I answered your question.
Maybe it happens also in the panel discussion, but my question would be something like, okay, if you have the two policy, what is policy based upon? Because so where's the policy coming from? What brings about the policy that would, and what then change is being, what is the change in general is being aimed at? Or if you say protest movement, so if you're saying, okay, what is the underlying thing? Are we saying that every group that somehow, or smaller than as big, which is somehow not optimally located within society, through protest moves that forward, and in that interplay, something will happen that brings the society forward. I'm just wondering what is the underlying mechanism that would bring about then a society that is at peace, that we within the 20-year window, right?
I think keeping engagement, keep engaging everybody, keep engaging people, keep looking at the problem as a collective problem, not just individual problems. Keeping it, put our resources into use properly. But I think one thing that has to change in our way of thinking is that to stop using each other. And the policies should direct that, to stop using each other, to stop using earth resources with no reflections and with no respect. I think individual changes and then collective changes as a result. That's what I'm thinking. Okay.
So we'll just try to get some clarifications on the task before we try to get into the task. So one approach is put perhaps a little more simply from inside to out: observation, producing understanding, insight, change. The third one, that's approach number one for sake of convenience. And approach number three is from outside to in, social engineering. You set up rules, policies, incentives, punishments. And the second one, if I can verbalize it differently, and maybe it's accurate or not accurate, is to create a different set of sort of belief structures. So today I believe and I'm motivated by my affiliation with my group, whether that's a religion or country, and if you can somehow substitute that for something else that may not be as divisive or may not have the side effects. We'll leave that out just for a moment. And because 1 and 3 are better contrasts for just for the starting point. So then the assumption is at the broad level fairly simple. The assumption for approach 1, observation, understanding, insight, change, the assumption is that that's in the realm of possibility. That there can be the kind of observation that is described, that's if not completely, reasonably impartial, that doesn't bring in one's own color. So that's assumption 1. Is that a possible, or is that just a nice idea? And then the second assumption is, if that is possible, can that, does it have within it the possibility of bringing about the words you're using, like understanding and insight? And then the third assumption is if there is understanding and insight the way it's being described, is that sufficient to effect actual change? So those seem to be the 3 sets of assumptions in this, and the assumptions in the third one, just for the contrast with social engineering, is even if you were able to, for the time being, come up with some policies and put them in place and regulate them, then the key assumption here is trying to sort of enforce behavior, which is often the end result of this process, right? I'm angry, and then the end result of that is I may hit someone or harm myself. So regardless of what led to it, by putting some constraints, either suppressing or encouraging, the end result, behavior, can that then feed backwards into changing the state or states from which it came, by changing that first? So that's the assumption in that approach of social engineering, that this is a pathway by which it can work, even though it may have originated in A, but if you change B, you will perhaps change.
Could I shortly interrupt so that's clear?
That's
Just,
all.
no.
That those are the assumptions.
Because you're somehow saying, I just want to, so you're meaning somehow to say, well, okay, there is anger. If there's a policy or a rule or an incentive for not being angry, or a punishment, okay. So.
No, not for not being angry, but for not behaving a certain way. So supposing there's a rule in the classroom that when you feel like hitting someone, you can't hit someone for 10 seconds. Otherwise there's a big fine. You hit someone after 10 seconds. So you have to announce, I'm going to hit you, so that the intent is clear, but then I have to wait 10 seconds. I'm being a bit silly, but you see, otherwise I get sanctioned, and if I wait 10 seconds, then it's okay. There's no sanction. It's 10 seconds to hit you back. Yes. No, I'm being silly, but you understand. So the policies around the behavior, not the source of it. You can't legislate, don't be angry, but you can try to legislate, don't do the behavior or not.
It will change the source. So I said, okay, so
Correct.
if you that, yeah.
Correct. So I'll give you, so not to, I'm absolutely not taking one position or the other or expressing a preference, but I can tell you in the area of health-related behaviors, which are things like smoking or alcohol abuse, drug abuse, things related to obesity, what you eat and so on, physical activity. Obviously, there are problems, and obviously people have been working on them for a long period of time. And today what is absolutely clear, and it's sad that that is the case, but I think it's sad, but I think it is clear there's no question about it with policy people, is that policy is more effective in effecting change at the population level. So there has been no amount of education about the detrimental effects of smoking or about things that teach you why do you have this urge and this and that, and you know, at the individual level, the results of that have been very unremarkable. The same thing with food, for instance. You know, everybody knows that ultimately you have to eat more calories than you expend to become obese. You just cannot become fatter if your consumption is does not exceed. And heaven knows how many programs there have been out there, and the results, I can give you numbers, I know this field quite well, are you know, extremely weak. It's absolutely clear. However, when you put policies in place, for example, no smoking, or no smoking 200 yards outside the building, otherwise there's a fine. You include that to not only restaurants, but now to pubs as well. You see astonishing drops in rates of smoking over time that are almost unbelievable. And you see corresponding changes in heart disease rates and those things. And these are really good studies because these have been done in phases all over. Not with smoking prevention, but yes, maybe with seat belts. Yeah. There is, with that, now for instance, we know that at least in America, one of the many sources of obesity are these sugar-sweetened beverages like Coke and Pepsi and so on. And just putting a tax on them of 1 or 2 cents a can has done more to reduce consumption than all the education that has gone into it. Even with smoking, taxation works very, very nicely on cigarettes as a policy. So the evidence, at least in these domains, is that social engineering at a population level is more effective. It's not perfect, but you know, by at least orders of 3 or 4 or 5 magnitude, it seems to have so then, and then the smoker is not smoking secretly. She or he is not smoking. You know, when the rates go down, you haven't really addressed the issue at the thing of, well, what is it that makes me, that produces this urge, or what is it that, you know, makes me search for a can of Coca-Cola. They're not drinking that. They're not smoking. That's true. It's not a secret. It's not.
Can I ask a clarifying question, sort of to Yap and then all of you too? There's a difference, I think, between changing behavior. So, you know, how many people commute in a single occupancy vehicle? How many people smoke? How many people recycle? You know, these things, yes, policy and your pocketbook are the policy, social pressure and your pocketbook are 3 of the most effective things at perceivable behavior. But I think if you look at, you know, this gentleman was talking about China earlier, and we were talking about, you know, India, nonviolence in India, changing what's going on internally, so your anger, you know, fear, violence, that's
so we're laying out the assumptions for each of those, and we're using these as examples, and we do get to, because there are states that drive these behaviors as well. People don't randomly decide to eat sugar or smoke or something like that. There is an internal state that is prompting the behavior, and you know, it may not be appropriate for certain internal states. This approach may be, you know, better working for others, but I'm just laying out the ground right now. That's all. I'm not. Yeah.
Before the break, could we ask David also to respond, because then we have the full cycle, and then after the break we can continue with the.
I think we're mixing up the question with the social question. And the religious question is about individual change through understanding, and that's what Krishnamurti is talking about. And sure enough that in the long run, if everybody becomes Buddha, you would have a different society, right? But in the short run, society may cease to exist before all that happens. So you have to consider both the strategies. One is what is the immediate way of solving the problems we are having in society or minimizing the disorder. And he is talking about how to end totally disorder. That's a different project, completely. And I don't think one is an alternative for the other. You need to work at both the things. That's my view. You don't have to agree.
Shall we just stop there? Okay. Well, I would construct the question or construe it slightly differently. Yes, one alternative is the psychological Krishnamurti related from within. Yes, one alternative is the social engineering. The middle alternative, I would not have characterized it as narrative, myth building, etc. To me, all that kind of thing is kind of a subset of the psychological, and it doesn't, as I listen to our 3-day event, that does not, for me, rise to the level of one of the three primary alternatives. The middle alternative, as I hear it, is biological, evolutionary. So we have the psychological, we have the biological, and we have the social engineering. And the underlying assumptions of those are, the underlying assumption of the evolutionary is that man's behavior is determined by genetics and natural selection, and it's largely determined by those variables. The underlying assumption of the social engineering is that man's behavior is determined by culture, government, the outward environment, and the underlying assumption of the alternative number one, psychological, is that man's behavior is determined at the level of the individual, not the genetics, not natural selection, not the environment in the sense of culture and government, but at the level of individual consciousness, and that is the only realm in which fundamental change can occur, not just how many people are smoking, but a deep, meaningful, significant change.
I'm glad I pushed you a bit to say this, because I think it's good. It's good to start with that this afternoon, because there are many things that will be interesting to uproot and to bring out. Yeah, great. Thank you, everybody, and see you all this afternoon.